So, hello and welcome to the Lewis Nichols Show. And I'm honoured today, actually, to have my guest join me on the show. It's the one and only, the brilliant Sir Tim Rice. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much. A pleasure
Brilliant.
to be here.
First of all, I kind of want to go back to the very beginning for you, which is where your love of music and writing, where that actually came from. Was that something you loved growing up?
Well, I certainly loved pop music when I was growing up, to the despair of my parents, I think, um, who were just rather funny about it. But those were the days of Elvis and the Everly Brothers and Chuck Berry and people who preceded the Beatles, and the Beatles loved them as well. But I was so much into pop records, I didn't really have a huge interest in musical theatre, although I was aware of the brilliant scores of a lot of the shows, because my parents had quite a few of the show cast albums in their collection. I had just Elvis and Co., but they had My Fair Lady, King and I, South Pacific Carousel, all those wonderful musicals, which I got to learn the songs virtually by heart for all those things, as well as all my pop fanaticism. But I never, ever thought when I was young that I would end up working primarily in musical theatre.
And if your parents had the choice, what would they have liked you to have done as a career if it was up to them?
Well, they were very supportive. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I left school without, I didn't want to go to university, and I can't really explain why. It just didn't appeal to me particularly. But I went to a good school, Lancing College in Sussex, where I had a pop group, and I got my A-levels, not particularly brilliant A-levels, but I passed all the exams. And I decided I should do something respectable if I wasn't going to university, and I opted to go into the law as a law student, because what A, one or two of my friends did, and B, I thought it would maybe lead to some sort of qualification. But it turned out that it was not very successful, because I just wasn't interested and I failed all my legal exams. So I really needed to do something that I actually enjoyed if I was to have a success in life at anything, at any level. And with my parents' support, I mean, they were quite enthusiastic about me going into the law, but it was soon fairly clear that wasn't working out. And I then got a job as a very junior office boy under the glamorous title of management trainee at EMI Records. And EMI Records in London in those days was the center of the world recording scene, because apart from the Beatles, they had virtually all of the big 60s British beat groups who were dominating the world. The only big ones they didn't really have, I suppose, were the Rolling Stones, but they had nearly everybody else. And they had rights for the Tamla Motown labels. They had the Capitol label with Frank Sinatra and his lot on. And all in all, it was a fascinating place to be, even at the most junior level. And I still didn't think for 1 minute I'd be involved in musical theatre. But I met by a string of strange coincidences. I met a young songwriter called Andrew Lloyd Webber, and I'd written a couple of pop songs in a pathetic attempt to get my voice onto record. And nobody liked my voice, wrongly, of course. Nobody liked my voice, but one of the songs I'd written for me to sing, and I'd written them purely so it wouldn't be compared unfavorably with somebody else's version of a hit. If I did a Tom Jones song or a Mick Jagger number or something, the first thing somebody would say, well, it's not as good as Tom Jones or Mick Jagger. But if I wrote my own songs, tune as well, then nobody could say so-and-so did it better than you. But the result of my tapes that I sent around to everybody, including EMI, was that one of the songs got recorded, but nobody liked the voice. And that song made me a songwriter. And of course, in those days, back in the mid-60s, nobody could just go out and make a record. It wasn't physically possible. Nowadays, anybody can make a CD in their front room with beautiful packaging, 12 tracks, if you want it, and then download it and issue it to the world. In those days, to get your work out to the world, you either had to have a record pressing plant in your bedroom, which not many people had, or you had to have incredible contacts and really work at it. And I was lucky to get one record, one 45 single out there with my name on it as the writer. It wasn't a hit, but it was still a bit of an achievement. And through that, I met Andrew, who was also trying to write songs, but he was determined to write for the theatre, which had never really crossed my mind. And he was very confident and very good. And when I first heard some of his stuff, and he said to me, I can't really do the lyrics. And the chap I was writing lyrics with, or was writing lyrics for me at school, doesn't want to go on. He wants to do something insane, like be a doctor or something. So would you like to write the words for this show I've written? And I did, and it worked really well. The show wasn't a hit. It wasn't a very good idea for a show. It was based on the life of Dr. Bernardo, the Victorian philanthropist. But through that feeling that we could work together, and our talents, such as they were in those days, fitted each other, really gave us the opportunity to get our work passed around to agents and this, that, and the other. And eventually we made it. But the thing that really got us going was a schoolmaster who heard our first musical and thought it was good, but obviously there was nothing he could do about it. But he said, look, while you're working to get to Broadway in the West End, why don't you write something for my school children? And we thought, well, okay. And there wasn't any money for it, but he said there was a possibility that it could be an educational hit. If you wrote something that his kids sang in the school concert, and if it was any good, then he was confident that other schools might pick it up, and it could be something that would have a reasonably long life. And as we, up to that point, earned zilch from anything we'd done, even though it seemed a bit of a come down from our West End dreams, it was fun to do. And we wrote what became Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And this really, I could have gone forever being boring about it, but Joseph, in which we made no attempt to write a musical that copied other musicals, which I'm afraid we did with the previous show. It was a bit like Oliver, and we were very over-influenced in a way by Rodgers and Hammerstein, all these brilliant theatre people. With Joseph, we wrote something that was really quite original in its concept and its style. I mean, there were many influences for me, like Flanders and Swan and Paddy Roberts and a lot of the great rock and roll lyricists, Jerry Lieber, Chuck Berry. But it was really something quite original. And we would never have got it on anywhere if we tried to sell it as a show. But as a school concert, it was a huge success. And it built up and got to other schools. And then it was recorded. And again, that wasn't a commercial success. But the record, the album, we had an album in our hands saying this is what we do. And the album led to decent management. And then we were given an offer of being paid, I think, 2,500 quid a week each. Not a week, sorry, a year, 2,500 pounds a year each for 3 years, during which time we would then have all the hours of the day to write something brilliant. This was the cunning plan. So ultimately, after much soul searching, I left EMI, where I had an interesting job, and signed up with Andrew to this management, David Land. And the first thing we wrote for them was Jesus Christ Superstar. Wow. So that was how I got going. I'm sorry to be so long about all this, but
no, I mean,
it's fascinating stuff.
It's incredible because, I mean, listen to what you just said with Joseph. It's like you went into it, you wrote it for the school, but you didn't anticipate just what this was going to become. Because if you look at the various adaptations all around the world, I bet when you wrote this, you never anticipated just how big it was going to become.
No, and we only wrote it for these young kids, aged 8 to 11, I think on the average they were. And they loved it. And we didn't have to worry about staging or choreography, or we were just concentrating on writing an entertaining piece. And one of the rules I learned quite early on through Joseph was that, if you're funny, people will listen to it more attentively if you're unknown. So I always recommend to new songwriters of musicals, try and be funny. Not every song has to be a thigh-slapping list of good jokes, but if you can be witty and allied to great tunes, such as the ones Andrew did for Joseph, people are going to listen to it more thoroughly. They're not going to put on the, the tape and the CD or whatever, downloading it today, and after 2 minutes say, well, that's all right, and then forget about it. But if it's funny, they'll stick with it. And also, you've got to write something which you would like if somebody else had written it, and you've got to write in the area that you feel strong, and you mustn't just think that show X was a hit. We'll try and copy it, which is what we did to a certain extent with our first musical, copying Oliver, which was a pretty good show to copy, I have to say. But so we learned a lot from Joseph, and we were amazed when sometime after the success of Superstar, when people said, what else have these guys done? Who are these guys? And they found Joseph, and Joseph got staged at the Edinburgh Festival, very modestly, by a brilliant director, Frank Dunlop. And it was a huge hit with adult performers because it was short and it was funny and it had great tunes. And then it went to the West End, and even then it still took quite a while to become the mega show it is now. That was some years later when Jason Donovan's version at the Palladium took off. But it's a funny show because it works at all levels. You can do it with 8-year-old children. I often have seen it, with children of very early school age. And in a way, I almost enjoy that more than the big glamorous shows, because it does really, you can see how much they enjoy it. But then if I go and see it on the road in a fairly big production, you can see that not only do the kids enjoy it, the mums and dads love it because they remember it. So we're very lucky with Joseph, but it wasn't written with any sort of formula in mind. We were just doing something almost as a favor to the schoolmaster. And but because we were writing what we liked and doing it for fun, I think that's why it worked.
For someone like you who's so passionate when it comes to writing, the same for Andrew Lloyd Webber, when you write something like this and you see other people do their version of your show, is there ever that moment where you're kind of like, oh, are they going to do it justice? Do you get nervous when you're about to watch someone else make a production of something you've written?
Well, I guess that's the case. If it's the opening night of a show, of a new piece, then I think you're bound to be nervous, simply because so many things could go wrong. Not just people might say, well, the show is crap, but something might go wrong if it's the first time, with the staging, and if it's a big complex show. But I'm always grateful for anybody doing it. If a show is truly established, like Evita or Joseph, to a great extent, I'm not really nervous, in the sense that if I go to the opening or if I go and see it somewhere, perhaps out of the country, I just think, well, this is a show which I'm very grateful to say has already been a big hit. It's established, and if this version doesn't work, it won't do much harm. But most of them do work because people, there's an awful lot of very good amateur and out-of-town theatres around in this country and indeed around the world. And there haven't been too many versions of shows of mine that I've seen and think, yikes, let me out of here. And sometimes that adds to the charm, especially if it's a school show, if it's kids doing it, and you see that they're really enjoying it. And it doesn't matter if they don't hit the right notes or if they got a couple of words wrong, as long as the overall thing makes them have a worthwhile and enjoyable time.
The incredible thing, what I've noticed so far is you kind of set out, and pop music was your love and your interest, and I guess it was something that you wanted to work towards. But it was almost like the right thing came and found you in the sense of musicals, because you look at what you've achieved, and it just shows that you were made to do that. So it's the fact that this came to find you with an incredible collaboration, of course, with Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Well, I think we were lucky in that respect. I think my love of rock music and pop music as my first interest and first introduction, coupled with Andrew's brilliant knowledge and expertise in musical theatre, I think, and of course the time at the very late 60s, hang on, my phone is going, this is a live thing, folks, I'm just going to turn it off. I've turned it off. I think that the combination of where I came from and where Andrew came from, which coincided with the arrival of rock on Broadway, which I think, and in the West End, which I think we were largely responsible for, giving it a big boost. Hair was the first show that did that, but we actually combined on record and then to the stage rock music and theatrical music with Jesus Christ Superstar. And I think that it helped that I had a pop background. Working in EMI, I knew quite a few people in the rock business by the time we were looking for people to do Jesus Christ Superstar. So I think our slightly different musical upbringings was a big plus. I mean, we would never have made it without Andrew's great knowledge of well, his brilliant talent. But he knew so much more about musical theatre than I did. I'd hardly ever seen a show when I met Andrew, because I didn't live in London, or I didn't live in London until about the time I did meet Andrew. And I was really aware of the songs, but that was about it.
Well, I want to talk about, another big part of your life and career, of course, with Disney. And that's something, you're a Disney icon with shows like Aladdin, Lion King. How did that collaboration come about? How did that all start off for you?
Well, Andrew and I did three big shows together, Superstar, Joseph, Evita. And then he wanted to do Cats, which didn't need lyrics because T.S. Eliot had already written the poems. I went off and did a show with a wonderful classical composer called Stephen Oliver called Blondel, which did okay on the road and ran for a year in London. But it's largely forgotten now. And I keep thinking, before I snuff it, I'd quite like to get Blondel back somewhere. It was a funny show. Anyway, be that as it may. I then wrote Chess with Bjorn and Benny of ABBA. I think people know that. After that, I wasn't quite sure what sort of direction to go in. And the Disney company were at that point contemplating doing the film of Evita, which hadn't at that point happened. We're talking about 1989. And I remember meeting a lot of the Disney executives, and I was sort of saying, I'd really like to get into some movies, do a bit of movie writing, because I had done a James Bond song, and I was interested in trying to write for films just for a bit. And they sort of showed some interest, but about that time, Disney had a mega revival with animation, starting really with Little Mermaid. They'd had a rather quiet period. They were still, it was a big company, but they hadn't had the huge success of their early brilliant films like Dumbo and Bambi and Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and all that lot. And they were trying under Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, the two top executives. They were trying to get back on track in a big way. And the first one that succeeded in doing that for them was A Little Mermaid, with wonderful songs by Alan Menken and Howard Ashman. Then Alan and Howard did Beauty and the Beast for Disney, which was an even bigger hit than Mermaid. And then they began to work on Aladdin. And so Disney was really throbbing with potential, and they felt they were back on track. And they decided that they didn't need to wait for one film to come out for the next one to be done. So they then got going with this thing called The King of the Jungle. And they said to me, would you be interested in coming on board a film, an animated film we're doing called King of the Jungle? And I said, what's it about? He said, well, it's about a lion cub and his wicked uncle. It's like Hamlet with fur. And I thought this sounds interesting. And I signed up with Disney, not exclusively, I hasten to add. And I went to various meetings. And at the very early days of what became The Lion King, there was just me and a couple of Disney producers and a director who actually changed, and he wasn't the final director, and a couple of drawings of lions, cartoons, and a very, very rough one-page storyline. And that eventually became The Lion King. And before The Lion King came out, and I'd been working on it for, over a year, and I'd suggested that as Alan Menken wasn't available doing Aladdin at the time, I suggested, when they said who could do the music, I said, well, what about Elton John? And to my amazement, they got Elton, and he turned out to be a major reason for that film's success. But before Lion King, can't remember what your original question was, but this is so interesting. Before Lion King was ready to go, in fact, a long way before, tragedy struck Aladdin when the great lyricist Howard Ashman died, and he hadn't finished the show. And Aladdin had a release date; it was all ready to go. Most of the actual animation was completed, but they were still missing 2 or 3 songs. And I was on the premises, and I think Disney quite liked what I'd done so far for The Lion King. So they said, forget Lion King for 6 weeks. We want you to go to Aladdin and work with Alan Menken on a couple of songs. And I knew Alan's work and admired it enormously, but I hadn't actually met him at that point. And obviously he hadn't met me. And I watched what was already created of Aladdin. It looked like another winner, but there wasn't a big ballad song in it. And Alan had written a lovely tune, which became a whole new world. So I was sort of thrown into this film, Aladdin. And that came out obviously before The Lion King. And I wrote another couple of songs for the film with Alan. And it was a great film, and the whole new world, a wonderful tune. Won an Oscar for Best Song. So I then went back to the Lion King team as an Oscar winner.
Wow.
I felt really embarrassed about this because I'd only been in the film business for about 6 months or a year. Anyway, they were all very happy for me, and we then carried on with The Lion King, which came out a year later. So I got into Disney because I met the guys like Michael Eisner. I met them through them not doing Evita, the movie. So that was really, and it was just at the right time because I'd run out of steam a bit. I wasn't quite sure what to do. I translated a wonderful French musical called Starmania, but that really didn't get beyond the record stage. And I'd written chess, and that was, taking off slowly around the world. But I didn't really have any major new projects. So Disney came just at the right time, and it was different. And I was working in Los Angeles a lot. I spent most of the early 90s in LA, and which I liked. I found it rather nice to be going there, spending half a year there. I was sort of commuting. They got to know me so well on the planes. It was, quite almost like Monday to Friday LA, and then et cetera, et cetera. So I was very lucky with that. And then The Lion King led to other things, and The Lion King went on to stage. And then I was asked to write some more songs for Beauty, because that went onto the stage. And then the one I really like, which hasn't yet come to England, is a show called Aida, which I wrote with Elton, which was a big hit on Broadway. And for some reason, it's played in lots of countries, but for some reason has never yet got to London, or indeed anywhere in Britain, I don't think. I think it's been 1 or 2 small productions, but it's an interesting show, and I hope will come to London fairly soon, i.e. in the next 12 months.
What was it like working with Sir Elton John? Because that's another great partnership for you. I mean, like you said, you both won awards together for The Lion King. So what was it like working with Elton?
Well, he's a lovely bloke. I knew him, before, and I recommended him because I did know him, and I'd actually written one song with him on one of his albums back in the 80s. But the thing that was different for me was that Elton liked all the lyrics first, and then all his hits, or virtually all his hits, his wonderful songs, have all been written when he's had Bernie Taupin's brilliant lyrics in front of him. So I had to change my tack with Andrew, and indeed with Alan Menken, and with Stephen Oliver when I wrote Blondel. The tunes nearly always came first. I mean, the odd line or the title might have somewhere come first, but the key thing to any musical is story. You've got to have a good story. And so whatever you do first, music or lyrics, before that, you've got to do the story and get your basic structure of the piece right. So, and for a film like The Lion King, having the lyrics first helped, because the animated film had to be constructed, and it was brilliantly by the writers. But my lyrics were very much part of that script. So I went to lots of meetings just talking about the script. I didn't really write any of the script. I might come up with the odd, thought. But they would say, right, well, we clearly need a song here in which the villain is, rousing his troops, or we need a song for the warthog or whatever. And it was very helpful that my lyrics had to pass the test of my colleagues at Disney before it went to Elton. Elton was going around the world as usual, playing lots of gigs and was very busy. But every time we sent him a lyric, a tune would come back pretty quick, within days, if not hours. But what we didn't want to do was to send Elton lots of lyrics that might have got the boot. And had we needed the tune first, that wouldn't have been so good, because Elton wouldn't really have known what sort of tune to write. I mean, he would have had an idea, obviously, ballad or rocker or whatever. But it would have been difficult, I think, to do it that way round. But it was much easier getting the plot and the words right. So there weren't too many false starts. I mean, there were one or two things where in animation, the plot or details of the plot can change fairly drastically. One would come in on a Monday morning and the team would say, well, you remember that song you wrote about for the giraffe and the hippo? Well, those characters have been axed. They're not in it anymore. So I thought, well, thank God we didn't send that to Elton. And of course, giraffes and hippos don't have agents. So it's very easy to get rid of their part. I mean, if you do a film with Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt, and you suddenly drop them from a vital scene or from the whole film, their agent's going to get on the phone and say, hey, what's going on? But a hippo doesn't have an agent. So we were able to get the story and the song's lyrics pretty good shape. There were lots of changes, of course, before it went out to Elton, and then Elton would come back and Elton's tune would fit, and we'd try it out with demos with great studio singers and see if the songs worked. I mean, that was roughly the process. It takes a long time to do these things. I mean, I was working on Lion King for 2.5 years, I think, and on Aladdin before anything came out.
I just want to go back, because earlier on you mentioned, obviously, Benny and Bjorn. Now, for me, they're icons. They're people that really understand music, the writing, the melody, everything about music they understand. So for someone like you, who is also of the same nature, that must have been kind of just the most amazing experience to work with two like-minded people, essentially. Well,
I've been very lucky because Andrew, Elton, Alan Menken, Bjorn and Benny, they're right at the top of the game. There's no question about that. I had this idea for chess, and Andrew was busy with Cats or Phantom or something. And I did float it vaguely by one or two other composers, but no one really picked up on it. And I was trying to explain that it wasn't a song about a show about chess. It was a bit like the Queen's Gambit. It was about characters whose lives are caught up in the chess world. And when I saw the brilliant Queen's Gambit a couple of years ago, I thought, we were doing this 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, pointing out that people in the chess world have really as dramatic up and down lives as anybody else. That wasn't the main point of the show, but the point of the show really was that I wanted to do a love story about the Cold War, about people defecting, and which all of which the chess world was very much involved with in the 70s and 80s in real life. And when I having not struck a chord with any composer I spoke to, like Marvin Hamlish, a great composer who I did do one or two songs with, and Andrew didn't really seem to pick up on it. I knew Bjorn and Benny's music publisher and former manager, Stig Anderson, because he had represented Superstar and Vita in Scandinavia. And he was now looking after ABBA, or he certainly was involved with ABBA still. And ABBA were, as you know, they were huge, and they were coming to the end of their run. The success was still phenomenal, but I think they were just felt, we've kind of done ABBA. We've had nearly 10 years at the top, and we want to do something else. So I caught them at a good time. And Benny said to me, I like this idea because in Sweden, we're so near to Russia. We're sort of, we're aware of this big country, or not quite on our doorstep, but not far away. And they felt very much, and equally, they were not totally part of, not at all part of America, but they were European, but they were kind of in the middle. And they said, this story, means quite a lot to us. And that was it, really. We sat down, and I spent a lot of 1984 83 and 84 in Stockholm, which is a very nice place to spend time in. And we wrote Chess. And again, I did the story. The difference and the harder thing, right? Chess was in a way harder to get going, to get sorted, because it's an original story. There's no, and it could be changed. With Superstar, nobody, could say, well, maybe we should not have Jesus get crucified. Maybe we should let him off, and he goes to raise cattle in downtown Jerusalem or something. And ditto Eva Peron, the story, or Joseph, the story was there, and you couldn't make drastic changes to the basic plot. Although in Superstar, and indeed with Evita, we put in Che Guevara in Evita, and I put Judas. Obviously he was there, but Judas has no script in the Bible really worth talking about. So I was able to write it from Judas's point of view and make that all up. But with Chess, it was a completely new story. Although I drew on, Bobby Fischer, Boris Spassky, Viktor Korchnoi, Kasparov, all these fascinating characters, some of whom had defected, some of whom wanted to defect, some of whom had, complicated love lives. All that was absolutely fascinating. And of course, the other thing that's fascinating is that politicians of all sides want to get involved in anything that's hugely successful. They always have to have a view. You see it today, and it's so ghastly when, whether a prime minister feels he has to get involved with a football team's success, whether or not he's actually interested, and or in some sort of showbiz thing. You think, get on with your job, mate. We'll do our job, you do yours. We're probably not doing ours very well, but you're doing yours even worse. It's a sort of, Chess had that sort of so many complex strands, and it was a difficult thing to do. And it's had one or two. The Broadway show was a complete flop, but there were changes to the storyline in Broadway which I did not approve of, and it was set in what was then the present day, which I did not approve of, because the Cold War was ending just as Chess opened on Broadway, and we were going, oh no, terrible news, the Berlin Wall's coming down, and which of course was great news for the world, but it was a piece that was set, and when it's done today, I always insist that it's set in 1975, 76, at the height of the Cold War. Otherwise, the story becomes pretty daft.
Do you ever reflect and look back, from doing that favor for the school, and then you look now, you've won an Oscar, an Emmy, a Grammy, a Tony Award, you've got a Hollywood Walk of Fame, you've been knighted by the late Queen. It's just incredible what you've achieved. Do you ever sit back and think, wow, I done pretty all right for the guy that started as the junior?
Well, of course I do. I'm always aware of good fortune, being in the right place at the right time, and stumbling upon a style with Andrew that hadn't really been done before, which was, as I said earlier, I think the introduction of contemporary music into theatre. It's interesting because Superstar, when it opened on Broadway, weirdly, and this is something else which was an accident, Superstar became a mega hit on record. That was the first time it had any impact. And the impact was primarily in America. Didn't do that well over here as a record to begin with. And it was a huge hit on American radio, and then on the charts, got to #1 in America, which was, to put it mildly, quite exciting for us. But it was then, and before that happened, nobody wanted to stage Superstar. We'd written it, and our manager, David Land, took it around to various theatrical producers, but no one really thought it would go, oh, no, religion, you can't have religion in the West End, blah, blah, blah. We said, it's not really religion. It's, it's inspired by a biblical story, blah, blah. Anyway, but we did get a record company, MCA, in England to handle it. And the record, when it came out in America, was what transformed the whole thing. And suddenly everybody wanted to stage it, but they wanted to stage it on Broadway first. And in those days, the Broadway audience and the record buying audience were much more separate than they became. Adults used to buy albums, Johnny Mathis' greatest hits, Frank Sinatra, all that great stuff, but the kids would buy singles. And then gradually, when rock, thanks largely to the Beatles and their companions, albums became more and more important. And that's why Superstar was able to take off in a big way as an album, because the album itself was like going to the theater. Buying an album was a big event, and you would sit in your study or your kitchen or drawing room or wherever and listen to it and that would be, I mean, nowadays that hardly ever happens. Music's there all the time, and people don't really sit down and listen to it unless they go to a live concert. But in those days, the record itself was enough. So when it came to staging Superstar, which obviously was written originally as a show, but had proved to be a record smash, the staging was a bit complicated because on the one hand, it was clearly a show. On the other hand, it was rock, and rock had never really worked in a big way on Broadway, except for Hair. But Hair was brilliant, but it was slightly different. It didn't really have much of an orchestra, and it had lots of wonderful songs, which were hits on the charts. But it was something that was almost like a rock concert coming to Broadway, whereas we wanted to do a theatrical piece which had rock elements in it. And on the record, we were able to play with big forces of both rock and theatre. When it came to Superstar on Broadway in 1971, just after the record hit, there was a Broadway audience who wouldn't normally be seen dead going to a rock concert or anything that was rock. And there was the rock audience out there who bought the album but wouldn't normally go to Broadway. But Superstar to a certain extent brought the two together, but it didn't really bring them together with a brilliant production. The actual production was fine, but the technology wasn't quite there, and it took really other shows like London to become the mega hits. But we were very instrumental in bringing rock into theatre. As I said, we weren't the very first, but we were the first to meld the two traditions of rock, contemporary rock, and slightly less contemporary theatre. And somebody else would have done it if we hadn't. We were just lucky to be in the right place at the right time.
We just mentioned previously about looking back at your success, but one of those, of course, was being knighted for your services to music. What was that like for you to receive that knighthood?
Well, it was a great honor, and like most people, I think you have that moment. You think, should I accept this or not? It'll give you a higher profile, which I wasn't necessarily that enthusiastic about. But I knew my mum would be pleased, and why not? I mean, people are quite happy to accept Oscars or gold discs or whatever. But when it comes to a knighthood, they sort of think, oh, well, I don't approve of the government. Well, hardly anybody seems to approve of the government, but I approve of my country by and large, in the sense that I'm happy to live here, and it's been very good to me. And for all its faults, it's not a bad place. In fact, it's a great place. And why turn it down? Because then you'd get people. In my case, I mean, even after Andrew got his knighthood, which was before me, I was getting a lot of, obviously, friends saying, why haven't you got one? I don't know. I've no idea. And I thought, well, at least it'll stop people saying that. Although as soon as I got my knighthood, Andrew was made a lord. And then people are saying, why haven't you been made a lord? And I thought, well, actually, to be honest, I don't want to be made a lord. I don't want to have to, start spouting in, the House of Lords or anything. Anyway, it's great to get, and I'm grateful for it. And I think a lot of people, friends of mine, were quite pleased about it. But it's only because I'm in a high-profile industry, I guess, that I've been lucky enough to get it. But there are plenty of people, I think, who should have had it, both before and after me, who haven't. And I think, I don't know why, some get it and some don't. But maybe some people turn it down. I mean, obviously, we know some people do turn it down. But they wouldn't turn down an Oscar, which is illogical.
When you look at the artists out there at the moment that you've not worked with before, is there anybody there that you would like to work with that you think, do you know what, I'd love to write for you?
Well, I suppose there are plenty of great composers who I admire. I don't think there's anybody. I mean, but I suppose Barry Gibb would be fantastic, but Barry writes such great lyrics as well. I don't think he needs anybody else. No, I think I'm quite happy. I mean, if I've got one or two projects sort of bubbling around at the moment, and whether or not anything will happen, I've no idea. But I'm sure I could reach out, as the expression goes, to writers I worked with before if I had something that I really felt might be worth giving a go at. But I sort of feel I'm not absolutely sure that the world needs another musical from me. And, it'd be very hard to do anything that makes as big an impact as some of the early shows. I'm working very hard on a show I wrote some time ago, a few years ago, with a very talented composer called Stuart Brayson, young man, and he's not that young now. He's been hanging around, but he's a lovely guy. And Stuart and I wrote a musical based on the wonderful book and film From Here to Eternity, which it's the story of GIs in Hawaii just before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and flung America into the war. And it's been performed in the West End. It didn't make its cash back, but it got quite good reviews. It's been done a few times in America, and we've got a fairly big production coming up in Milwaukee early next year. So it would be nice. I'm putting quite a bit of energy into that, seeing if we can make that a success, because I think it's a good show. There's some lovely songs in it. We had, one or two of them got covered, which is quite difficult these days. Michael Ball did one, and wonderful singer Claire Teal did one. And it's a good score and a great story. And story, as I've said before, I think is king. If you've got a good story, that's a help. So that's something I'm keeping my hand in with.
Well, Sir Tim, honestly, this has been an absolute pleasure for me to have you on the show, just to talk about your career so far. The fact that you've got all these projects that are coming up. You just mentioned the show that you're working on, but is there anything else that you've got coming up that you can tell us about?
Well, with Michael Eisner, the former Disney chief, who's now got his own production company, my son Donald and I are producing a film series on the life of William IV, the Sailor King, who had quite an interesting life. And he's a king that not too many people know much about, including me, before we began researching it. So that's a television production thing. So I'm sort of moving into one or two other areas. I dare say there might be a song in that somewhere, but then on top of that, I'm hoping to get Aida over here next year, From Here to Eternity. These are shows we've written already, and there's meant to be a brand new version of Joseph on film coming up, directed by John M. Chu, who directed, well, he's just working on Wicked at the moment, and after Wicked, he wants to do a new film of Joseph, which will be great. So there's always things happening. And there's one or two ideas floating around, but you never know. It's always the ones you don't expect that will take off suddenly.
Well, honestly, thank you so much for giving me your time today. I know you've got some friends over today, so I really appreciate your time. It's been an absolute honor for me.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lewis. It's been very nice to talk to you. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hope